Hello church, and welcome to our next video in our Bible Characters Through the Alphabet series. We are on to the letter I, and I've chosen Ishmael. I don't know if you've heard of him before or whether you've studied him before. He was a son of Abraham. So for those who don't know the story, Abraham, or Abram as he was a friend of God, walked close with God, and God made a covenant with him saying, look, if you keep to the commands that I give you, and if you circumcise your children, then I will make you into a great nation, and I will give you a land that will be yours, and I will be with you, and I will walk with you, and I will take care of you, and eventually I will give you a place in heaven. So you've got Abraham with this fantastic covenant with God. And that covenant is going to be for his family for generations and generations. The issue with that is that he and his wife, Sarai, who later became Sarah, were very, very old. And Sarah doubted that God was going to be able to get her to have a child. So she went to her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and, I don't think Hagar had much choice. She said to Abraham, take her as your wife, have children through her, and at least that way we can build a family together. So Hagar and Abraham had a child called Ishmael. And then the Lord came back to Abraham and said to him, your wife Sarai, she's not going to be Sarai anymore, she's going to be Sarah. She is going to conceive a child, and that child will be the person with whom I have a covenant. But I won't forget Ishmael. I will bless him, and he will also be the head of a great nation. But he will also be at war with all of his brothers. Now, poor Ishmael, he had a bit of a rough deal. You see, Sarah went on to have a son called Isaac. I'm sure you know a lot more about Isaac than about Ishmael. We talk about him a lot more. And when he was born, Sarah was incredibly happy. And she was there partying and enjoying the fact that she'd finally got a child. And she looks across and she sees Ishmael laughing and, as she says, mocking Isaac. And she says to Abraham, they cannot stay here. They cannot have a share in his inheritance. So Hagar and Ishmael get sent away into the desert. And in the desert, Hagar's really worried they're about to die of thirst. And God comes to her again and says, look, you are not forgotten. And he opens her eyes and she sees a well. And they survive their time in the desert. And Ishmael grows up and Hagar finds him an Egyptian wife. And he becomes the head of another nation. He's actually mentioned a lot more in the Quran, and I've got a feeling, I think that it's from that nation that Islam and the Muslim tradition sort of flows, and the history follows Ishmael rather than Isaac. And as we know, they've been at war ever since. Also in the Quran, when Abraham goes to sacrifice his son, in the Bible it mentions Isaac, but in the Quran it just says his son. And some Muslims will believe that it's Isaac, but others believe that actually it was Ishmael who was being sacrificed by Abraham. So it's a bit of a random and weird passage. It stems from this lack of faith of Sarah, and just like in the Garden of Eden where Eve thinks, right, I'm going to do this, and convinces Adam to listen to her. Again, Sarah's lack of faith convinces Abraham to step away from that promise of God, to step out of that place of surety in him. And that has huge consequences. It has huge consequences for Hagar and huge consequences for Ishmael. And I think that's one of the things that is quite worrying in life. The things that we do have consequences. And I find myself a lot of the time when I'm talking to non-Christians and I want to show them God's love, I don't often mention the fact that actually when we mess up, when we don't treat people fairly, when we see injustice, that injustice often isn't reflected back into our own lives, it's often reflected onto others. The way of the earth is not perfect, and it's really unfair. And it's why it is so important that we are studying the Bible, that we are in tune with God, because it's God's strength and his love working in us that helps us to live the right way and helps us not to impose those what can be horrific consequences onto others. The other thing I like about this passage though, which is a bit more positive, is Ishmael is the son of a lack of faith in God. You know, he's the son of Hagar, who is probably forced into a relationship with Abraham. And God doesn't just write him off because of his identity. God recognises his situation and comes and meets with him. And I mean, what an honour to get to meet with God. God gives him a future too and makes a new plan for him. I'm not sure if Ishmael was ever really part of God's original plan. He definitely wasn't there mentioned in the covenant that God made with Abraham. But our God isn't a God who sticks strictly to one way of life and doesn't make space for anything that happens outside of that. He understands that we are a broken people. There are consequences to our actions. But if you've done something and you are now feeling awful about it, remember that God can still work in those situations. He can still be in them. Don't give up on praying and bringing those situations to God, because he is the one who is greater than anything that we could ever do. He is the one who is bigger than any of the problems that we have or the situations that we cause. And he can work through them. So the third thing about Hagar and Ishmael is that they actually appear in the New Testament as well. If you look in the book of Galatians, in the letter, I did have the page open, apologies, let me find the page again. Here we go, Galatians, and it's chapter 4. And in this letter, Hagar and Sarah are used by Paul to be pictures of our identity before God. And he says Sarah is the free woman and Hagar is the slave. And Ishmael is born into slavery and his identity is slavery. And Isaac is born as a free person. When we are born again in Christ, we are born as people of promise. People who can live in the promise of the future that God gives us in heaven. We don't have to be constrained by the rules, by all of the slavery that comes with a life of sin and an absence of God. We are born free and into that amazing place where we know our future, where we don't have to worry about the fact that we're not worthy of it, because Jesus gives us this new identity that means that we can be sure of it. So Ishmael is an amazing person to think about. As I said, you can find him in Genesis. I don't think I told you the reference. Genesis chapter 20 is where you'll find him in the Old Testament, and in Galatians chapter 4. And when our actions do have consequences, and they are often not ones that reflect on ourselves but on others, so let's be careful in the way that we live our lives. 2, when things go wrong, God adapts in order to meet those circumstances. He still hates oppression and he will fight against it and fight for justice for those people who are facing the consequences of other people's actions. And 3, our new belonging and our new birth in Christ is a birth into promise and into freedom. So I hope you enjoyed some thoughts on Ishmael. Again, a really interesting character. And we'll be back next time with the letter J. So I'll see you then. Bye!